welcome to this virtual event at the Wiener Holocaust Library. I'm Barbara Warnock, the Senior Curator and Head of Education at the library, and I'm really pleased to be chairing tonight this virtual event, one of the first events that we've done in this format. So pleased that so many of you have been able to make it here tonight. We're here to celebrate the launch of Marianne, Hirsch and Leo Spitzer's new book, School Photos in Liquid Time, Reframing Difference. Originally, this event was supposed to be held tonight in person at the library, but for obvious reasons, that's not proved to be possible. But we're so pleased that we have been able to rearrange and have this event tonight online with an international panel and an international audience. For those of you who are new to the Wiener Library, we're based in Russell Square in London, and we're one of the world's oldest archives of material on the Nazi era and the Holocaust. And you can find out more about our work on our website. Before I introduce our speakers tonight, I just want to say a word about how the event's going to run and be organised. So you, our audience, are all muted. There should hopefully be some time at the end for some questions, and you can ask your questions via the chat function in Zoom, and I can put some of these to the panel. We'll be sending you details tomorrow in an email of Marianne and Leo's book, but also books by others of our speakers as well as details of an exhibition that will be discussed tonight as well. Tonight, the event will close with some remarks from the director of the Wiener Library, Dr. Toby Simpson. But before that, we'll be hearing from our four speakers. They'll be presenting some information and then having a discussion. And then, as I say, hopefully there'll be some time for a few questions from the audience at the end. So I'm now just going to introduce our speakers. So our speakers tonight are Professor Marianne Hirsch, who is the William Peterfield Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University and Professor in the Institute for Research on Women, Gender and Sexuality. She was born in Romania and educated at Brown University. Her works include The Generation of Post-Memory, Writing and Visual Culture After the Holocaust, and Ghosts of Home, The Afterlife of Chernowitz in Jewish Memory, co-authored with Leo Spitzer. Professor Leo Spitzer is Katatap Vernon Professor of History Emeritus at Dartmouth College, New Hampshire. He was born in Bolivia to parents fleeing Nazi persecution in Austria, and he is a cultural and comparative historian working in the field of memory studies. His works include Hotel Bolivia, The Culture of Memory in a Refuge from Nazism. Professor Eva Hoffman is an acclaimed writer and visiting professor at UCL London. She has taught literature and creative writing at various universities, including the University of East Anglia, MIT, and Hunter. Her works include After Such Knowledge, Memory, History, and the Legacy of the Holocaust, and Shtetl, The Life and Death of a Small Town and the World of Polish Jews. Professor Griselda Pollock is a professor in the School of Fine Art, History of Art and Cultural Studies at the University of Leeds. Her works include Charlotte Solomon, The Nameless Artists in the Theatre of Memory. And I'm going to hand over now to Marianne and Leo for the first part of tonight's event.
Good evening. Actually, good afternoon where I am. We're going to do this as a joint talk, and we want to begin by thanking Barbara Warnock and Toby Simpson and the Wiener Library for this invitation, and just to say how honored and thrilled we are to be in conversation with Eva Hoffman and Griselda Pollock. Thank you both for being here. Presenting this book at the Wiener Library at this particular moment is especially meaningful. It's a moment when the coronavirus pandemic is at once connecting us across the globe and also separating us into ever smaller local communities. It's a moment when social inequalities dividing us are being exposed with enormous force, and also when a growing social movement links us in solidarity and provides some hope for the future. Our book speaks to all these issues specifically by connecting Jewish history, and specifically the history of the Holocaust, to other histories of difference, of assimilation, exclusion, persecution, and resistance. And also by exploring how libraries and archives, how photography and art are implicated in these deep histories of inequality, and how they also allow us to imagine justice and resistance. It's also a particularly ironic moment in which to think about a book on school photos and about school photos as we navigate school closures and stay-at-home orders. School photos are institutionally sponsored images that provide visual evidence of what schools want to create. They want to create commonality, conformity. They want to minimize differences among members of a school class to serve a society and its institutions. In ordinary circumstances, we might resist this coerced form of belonging. We might point out that difference and inequality persist despite the visual uniformity that's promoted by class photos. But in moments of crisis, such as the one in which we find ourselves in a global pandemic, the togetherness of school, the urge for learning with one another that are made tangible and real in a group photo appears all the more precious. What is school, after all, when collectivity, with all its positives and negatives, is suddenly eviscerated everywhere by the threat of infection? What is school when each of us sit in front of our own screens in our own private spaces, physically disconnected? So our book speaks to some of these issues, and we wanted to today to discuss with you how it actually came to be.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Marianne just led into my discussion, which is how did this book come to be? As you heard already in the introduction, over the course of years, my research and writing as a historian on various topics connected to the history of colonialism, assimilationism, marginality, personal and cultural memory. I've worked in various continents. I've worked in the Americas, I've worked in Africa, I've worked in Central and Eastern Europe, and I've always made it a practice to collect photographs that might in some ways be relevant to my interests. And in collecting these photographs, I quickly noticed two things. First, the ubiquity of school and class photos. And you see one of the slides up there, you can see school photos taken in many, many places around the world. And secondly, that school photos have a very long history, that they appear very, very early in the history of photography. You can see from the photo that is up there of Tulalib children with teachers in Washington Territory around 1865. This is a picture that we talk a lot about it in the book, but it's an amazing photograph of children who are made, in a sense, to conform and to look like the dominant. Now, in talking to Marianne over time, as we always do, about these projects, some of the underlying premises of what eventually developed into our school photos in liquid time dawned on us. First of all, is the realization that technical innovations in photography in the second half of the 19th century coincided with the development of state-accredited education in Europe and in the Americas and in the Euro-American colonies. What you have in technical innovations, of course, the movement from the daguerreotype, one of a kind, to photography as reproducible, low cost prints that are available from photography, and this enables many, many different uses for photography. And it's exactly these uses that were taken advantage of by national, by imperial, by state authorities. Authorities that sought to manage ethnic, religious, and racialized differences in their heterogeneous populations. They used school photography to further their assimilationist and socially transformative ideologies. And we can say more about this later on if we have time. But of course, my interest in writing this book is also personal. It stems from my first school photographs that are up there now for you to look at. These are two images that were taken early in the 1940s in what was called the Kinderheim, the children's home and kindergarten that was sponsored by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee for Jewish refugee children in La Paz, Bolivia, where, as you heard, I was born, in a country where my Austrian parents and approximately 20,000 European refugees from Nazism found a haven. It was when I connected these school photos made while the war was still raging in Europe and the Holocaust continued, to photos of school children taken at about the same time in Jewish ghettos and camps in Nazi-occupied Europe, and also to school photos taken in concentration camps set up for Japanese Americans in the US. That the question that became central to our book, what do school photos actually do? What functions do they serve? That those questions became very compelling for us. And it is especially compelling because so many of the school photos that we looked at were taken clandestinely. They were taken when there were interdictions against the use of cameras and photography, and yet people took what we would define as school photos.
Well, as you can see here from my own third grade picture, my interest in this work also emerged from a personal history. But actually, it was a little more than 10 years ago that Leo and I were invited to a conference on feeling photography, which then turned into a very important book, responding to early Victor Bergen book on thinking photography. And in 2008, Elspeth Brown and T. Fu sponsored a conference at the University of Toronto and asked us to give one of the keynote talks. And it was at that point that we began to look at our own school pictures and wondered, what does it feel like to be a subject of school? What would those feelings be? And here's my own photo of children growing up in a communist autocracy that certainly aims to erase individual differences, whether they be differences of class, religion, social status, racialized differences. But yet, if you're in that photo, you know exactly how to read those differences. The institution cannot erase it, though the technology of photography really aids the institution in doing so. But really, more than some of these insights that we've already discussed, probably the most inspiring, what most inspired us to write this book is the discovery that artists from around the world have engaged with and have reframed school photos in their work. Here we're showing you a picture of an image of the work The Class by Vic Muniz. Artists like Muniz reveal the power of institutions to frame children, and they also help us disrupt and dislodge that power through what Gabriel Moser calls the disobedient gaze. And that disobedient gaze was an important term for us, a notion for us. They invite us to look at these images, even the archival images, even while questioning the stories they tell and the ways in which they tell them. So here we have an image that's made up of cut up photographs. And I think what Muniz is showing us is how schools make, unmake, and remake us as subjects and as citizens, and how they foster unlearning as much as learning. So this dialogue between everyday archival images and the work of artists who reframe them is one of the distinctive aspects of our book, and also was the occasion for the exhibition at the Hood Museum of Art, which closed prematurely, but which combined archival images and these artistic reframing. So let me just show you a couple of examples, some of which you no doubt know that come out of the history that the Wiener Library is so beautifully documented. And these are artists who respond to specific archival images. So we all know the work of Christian Boltanski, who has used this one image from the highest gymnasium in Vienna to very full effect. We have an incredible image that's hard to explain by the Argentinian artist Mirta Kupferman called Bearing Witness, in which she tries to imagine what the children photographed by the Nazi official Walter Genewein are looking at when they look into the lens of his camera. And she imagines that Mendel Grossman, who's one of the Ghetto photographers, is actually there photographing Genewein so that the Nazi official becomes the object of the gaze rather than the one wielding the camera. And then also these two works by Lori Novak, who reframes the image of the children of Lisieux, the children who were saved and then also deported and killed in Auschwitz. And of course, as one more example, the important work by Carrie Mae, with the American artist Carrie Mae Weems, who responds specifically to this enormous archive of images from the residential schools that the US set up for Native American and African American children in order to civilize, to assimilate them into the American mainstream. And Weems, in her Hampton project, speaks specifically to the ideology of before and after that these images kept trying to promote, which is the success of the transformation of these children and the erasure of their cultures. So just to close, I think you've already seen this a little bit in some of the examples we showed. Let me say a couple of words about liquid time, which is part of our title, School Photos and Liquid Time. Now, of course, photographs do more than document the time of their production, the event of their taking. They all create a sense of a future in which they will have new roles to play as objects of memory and as documents of history. So especially, I think this is especially true of photos of children who are at the beginning of their lives and of children in school who measure time as progress from grade to grade. So we've tried to complicate that notion of temporality and to try to appreciate how photographs keep developing, as it were. And we borrowed the idea of liquid time from a very short, really quite beautiful essay by the artist Jeff Wall, Photography and Liquid Intelligence. And he imagines that, thinks about the analog image in its developing bath, where before the image emerges, before it is fixed into meaning, many different things could happen and it could take many possible shapes. So we think of liquid time as a way that photographs are never actually fixed, but remain open to ever new interpretation and to ever new meanings as history evolves. And just in closing, this is a really good example, I think, of this notion of liquid time. It's a work called The Class by the Argentinian artist and activist Marcelo Brodsky, who made this after the end of the dictatorship in Argentina, where he brought his own school class back together and inscribed the image itself with the histories of some of the students in his class. And the ones that are circled and crossed out, sadly, were the ones who were disappeared and murdered by the dictatorship. And so I think what Brodsky does is something else that's really important to us in the book, is to use school photos not as instruments of an institution, but as instruments of resistance through which you could imagine justice and engage in solidarity. So that's our little introduction, and I think I'm turning this over to Eva, and I will stop sharing my screen now. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let me say what a great pleasure it is to be part of this discussion and conversation about Marianne's and Leo's extremely illuminating and thought-provoking and original book, and a book which is also visually riveting, because I was looking at these images again. I thought, many of them are disturbing in a way, but they're so stunning, and they lead you into so much. So I am going to talk about a particular photograph from a school in the Polish town of Siedlce, a town east of Warsaw, in the interwar period. Actually, I'm talking about it at Marianne's suggestion, and Marianne knew that I would be interested in it, since I grew up in Poland and went to elementary school there. Although oddly enough, I've realized I do not have any school photos from that time. I don't think they were taken, unless it was my parents' natural subversiveness, which prevented me from being part of them. But I don't think so. The first school photo I have of myself is from the first class I attended in Canada after immigration. So I'll focus on a particular photograph, but I wonder, Barbara, if you could show us several photos from the school, all of which were part of an exhibit at the Hood Museum associated with the book. They're not part of the book, but they were part of the exhibition. They cannot be shown in a slightly larger format. If not, that's okay, of course. Yeah, that's better. Okay, so yes, this is the photo on which I will concentrate. So to give you a sense of the context, Queen Jadwiga School, where these photos come from, was a progressive public girls' school. And certainly in these photos, it looks like a happy place. The young women in it are not conforming to any stereotype, even though they're dressed uniformly at various points. They're full of vitality and youthful eagerness. Some of them are striking slightly flirtatious poses. The school had a very small minority of Jewish students in a town which actually had a large Jewish population. But in these photos, they're indistinguishable from the others. And this in itself is significant. I don't think this was a sign only of kind of forced conformity. This was a period in which the younger generation of Polish Jews were often abandoning orthodoxy and becoming emancipated. It was also a period of tremendous flowering of Jewish culture in Poland and a great deal of Jewish political activity. There were small towns which housed 17 Jewish parties, political parties, which probably was not all that useful. But in any case, this acculturation, very different from assimilation, is reflected in these photos. But I am going to focus on this particular image, partly because Marianne and Leo have unearthed, through very impressive detective work, the particular stories of several figures captured within it. It is also a photograph which, interestingly, I think, neither confirms nor confounds our expectations, which records quite individual personalities and very unique stories. It's something that we rarely can infer from collective photos, although many of them, of course, do have very particular stories. So it neither confirms nor confounds our expectations, and it records quite individual personalities and very unique stories. It shows a small group of young women in a simple classroom, looking laughingly at a young teacher who's pointing to some rather complicated looking mathematical equations. One actually would be interested to know what they were learning. I recently had a chance or was actually asked to investigate Jewish education, actually, in Poland during the interwar period, and was amazingly sophisticated. But in any case, judging by the expression on the students' faces, the teacher may have just cracked a joke. There is a sense of warm camaraderie among them. So this is the eternal present, so to speak, of the image. As Roland Barthes once pronounced, what the photograph reproduces to infinity has occurred only once. But of course, photographs, as we have heard from Marianne and Leo, exist in several overlapping temporalities. And this seemingly ordinary and quite warm image holds within itself a complex past and an equally complicated future. The photograph was taken in 1934. One of the young women in it is Jewish, the others are not. The teacher may have been Jewish as well. What the story behind the photo reveals is that these young women knew each other from age 10 until graduation, and that 3 of them, including the Jewish student, Tzipora, went on to attend university in Warsaw after. The moment recorded in the photo catches a period of Polish-Jewish coexistence in which such friendships were possible and more frequent than many of us might imagine. A moment before right-wing factions in Poland gained strength and discrimination against Jewish students assumed some ugly forms. After university, 2 of the young women went abroad to further their professional studies. Tzipora, the Jewish student, went to Lithuania, where she hoped to avoid anti-Semitic persecutions, and where she met a Jewish man whom she married. But when the mood in Poland became more threatening, the young couple moved back to Siedlce in order to be with their parents. This is all a story unearthed by Marianne. But there, the story becomes much darker. Siedlce became the site of a ghetto to which Tzipora, her husband, and their families were taken, and which was surrounded by barbed wire in 1941, just as Tzipora gave birth to a daughter, whom she named Rachel. There were mass deportations to Treblinka, which Tzipora and her baby survived by hiding in an attic. At some point, in hopes of avoiding the worst, Tzipora fled with her baby to the home of Irena, one of the young women pictured in the photo. Tzipora and baby Rachel were welcomed by Irena and her mother with open arms. Even though hiding Jewish people in Poland carried enormous risks and was punishable by death, and this sentence was administered in quite a few cases. So Irena's and her mother's decision required enormous bravery. At some point, Zofia, another young woman in the photo, who was part of the Polish underground resistance, joined them. However, after a while, Tzipora returned to the ghetto, where she rejoined her husband, leaving Rachel, the baby, behind, a decision which I confess I find baffling. The explanation given was that Tzipora believed she looked too Semitic to pass for an Aryan. But surely her chances of survival in the ghetto were even smaller, and tragically, both she and her husband died there. Now, I think as we read these stories, it is extremely difficult for us to judge the choices made by various people in situations where really no good choices were to be made and in which decisions had ultimate consequences. And yet, at least in the initial stages of the Holocaust, choices were made. I recently wrote a preface to a memoir by the feminist theorist Hélène Cixous, in which she recounts the histories of her family during the Holocaust, and in which she tries to decode exactly this question. Why did some of her relatives escape from Germany and others didn't? In Tzipora's case, I don't know how the explanation for her return to the ghetto was arrived at, but given her friend's willingness to hide her, I wonder if there were other factors at work. For example, wanting to rejoin her husband while knowing that her daughter was in safe hands. We'll never know the actual future of this photograph. The rest of the story, though, has a happier and very moving outcome. The two school friends who hid Zipporah before she went back to the ghetto adopted her daughter Rachel, again at great risk. They clearly came to think of her as their own child and wanted to keep her after the war. But Rachel's uncle wished her to come to Israel, and she moved to a kibbutz there and eventually emigrated to New York. So these were friendships which stood the most severe of tests, and which rather amazingly continued into the second and even the third generation, as Marianne's and Leo's research reveals. To go to the question of photographs themselves. In many of the photographs taken in the period leading up to the war, and especially during the Holocaust, we think we can imagine the terrible future awaiting their subjects. Of course, most often we don't know if we're right or not. But this particular image captures a moment in young people's lives whose future we could not possibly foretell. To me, the photograph also speaks of longer history, the history of Polish-Jewish relations, which I've written about and which I'm afraid I could talk about for hours, but I promise I won't. It is a very fascinating and largely an unknown past of a coexistence which extended over nearly 10 centuries and which included periods of what really was multiculturalism avant la lettre, as well as times of conflict and separateness. Siedlce itself had a majority Jewish population in some periods, and I'm sure that as in other towns, Poles and Jews living there knew each other, traded with each other on market days, knew a few words of each other's language. But the sense of deeper separateness and otherness was never overcome on a larger scale. And during the darkest of times, this meant that most non-Jewish Poles did not consider their Jewish neighbors to be within their sphere of responsibility and did not come to their aid. However, there were also people like the two young women in the photo and their families who took enormous risks to their own lives in order to help and rescue their Jewish friends. Again, there were more of them than we probably assume if we think of Poland exclusively as a site of anti-Semitism. It is a history into which my first insights came from my parents' pasts. Both my parents grew up in a tiny shtetl in the Ukraine, which had Jewish, Polish, and Ukrainian populations. Their lives were saved by Poles and Ukrainians who were absolutely risking their own lives to do so. Their entire families were exterminated in a massacre ordered by the Nazis. But there were people who came to rescue their Jewish friends, and there were more of them than we probably assume, as I said, if we think of Poland exclusively as a site of anti-Semitism. So I'm grateful to Marianne and Leo for giving us insight into that less known story and a point of entry into a more complex and richer understanding of the past. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's my turn to thank Marianne and Leo, and also say how grateful I am to have been involved. Every new publication of Marianne and Leo is an event to be welcomed, as well as read with very, very deep attention. When we encounter the books they've co-authored, we're given a triple dose of brilliant insight, fine-tuned historical research, and transformative close reading of images. The unique form of cultural analysis they've created is as elegantly written as it is theoretically and, dare I say, politically hard-hitting. In their subtle entwining of memory and materiality, of image and effect, of historical violence and acts of resistance, new dimensions of the everyday, that is also the extraordinary, are brought into view, and this book is no different. In their introduction, Marianne and Leo set out the coordinates for this study of school photos in liquid time. showing us how school photos bring us face to face in a very crucial way with young people, specifically with children, but not within their family context or the family album, but as subjects of and subjected to an institution. And this institution is really, in Louis Althusser's terms, as they say, a state ideological apparatus, which is also not only an instrument of education, but mostly of assimilation and acculturation, sometimes desired, quite often not. It's also a mechanism, as they show, for cultural murder, or we might even say a colonialist murder of indigenous and non-European and non-Christian cultures, which are as a result denied the status of being cultures. And indeed, the school becomes this instrument of rationalization. So I'm going to share my desktop, I hope. Wait a second, I'm sharing my, now, how do I get to my, there we are, we'll just open this up. I'm going to show some photographs, which I realize do include people whose permission I haven't asked in advance. So you may see them, but we may see what we do with them subsequently. Okay, I have to go this way. Now, in the spirit of the lockdown, my own sister began cataloguing her photo collection. This prompted me to hunt down an album she and my mother had made 50 years ago, one for each of my mother's 3 children, with all our childhood photographs. Inevitably, I found in my album one of my own class photos from a school I briefly attended in Oakville, Toronto, Canada in 1961. There is, however, in that album, no photographic trace of the other 7 schools I attended when living in South Africa, French Canada, and eventually Great Britain. So there was no way to plot out my migrancy or my strange introduction to 4 disparate cultures and several languages through the institution of the school. Serendipitously, the trip down memory lane of the incomplete photographic memory of my migrant school years coincided with the publication in 2020 of the alumna book of the college that I attended at the University of Oxford. The 2019 image of the Brown Book had sponsored a class photograph, sported a class photograph showing for the first time students and their tutor, the first 9 women students and their tutor at Lady Margaret Hall in 1878, one of the first colleges for women at Oxford University, where women were allowed to study but were not awarded degrees until 1920. Sadly, this beautiful college, founded in the honor of women's struggle for education, went coeducational in 1979. In 2020, the Brown Book carried a short story about Lady Margaret Hall's brief and rather inglorious participation in the University Challenge, a TV show which sets colleges against each other in a quiz. Here is the proof. I was their captain, famously winning a key point by stuttering the word rat-a-tat-a-tat-a-tooey. As a result of contacting the story's writer, Janet Keat, whom you see on the left, she sent me the class photograph of our arrival as students, if I can make it work, at Lady Margaret Hall in 1967, where Janet and I sat side by side, grinning happily in the center of the front row. In 2017, a group of septuagenarians reunited to honor the 50 years since we were once sat in that photograph on this same lawn at Lady Margaret Hall. Were we recognizable to each other? Had time so changed our hopeful young selves that we could no longer see the faces we once knew? What had we done in the meantime? We, being that generation of students who went to university circa 1968, who would witness or participate in student revolts, the civil rights movement, the gay and lesbian movements, the anti-war movements, and of course the women's movement, that some of us, just a few, would make their life's course, personally, politically, intellectually, and professionally. Does any of this show in the picture of this cohort of educated all-white women? Between the two images as photographs, we discern the contrast of 1960s formality and required ladylike poses in opposition to the informal, vibrant gaiety of our older selves, whose lives have been lived, whose styles of life and appearance have chosen. We've definitely got better hair and obvious pleasure at our reunion. And later, in formal evening dress, we once again lined up in stacked orders to show that we could only tell a strange tale of aging, a tale of time, and not as liquid as perhaps we would like it to be. Now let me move rather shockingly from this gathering in June 2017 to something closer to the book we are addressing tonight. Argentina's Dirty War between 1976 and 1983 was waged by the right-wing military dictatorship of the generals against students like us, wiping out the generational cohort of university students in their 20s. The dictatorship targeted and destroyed those seeking education so that they would be equipped to participate in and struggle for democracy, to challenge militaristic, nationalistic, patriarchal and capitalist systems, to denounce authority and make change in Latin America. Marianne Hirsch and Leo Spitzer's book includes this image called La Clase, made in 1996, as an artwork by the Argentinian artist Marcello Brodsky. Born in 1954, so a little younger than I am, from his larger project Buena Memoria, Good Memory, this artwork features his class photo from 1967, the year I went to Oxford. Brodsky has traced many of his cohort as he could, annotating the photograph with the information he discovered about each person's future. Those circled and crossed out, as Marianne and Leo have said, are the disappeared, the missing, the polite way of saying that they were murdered by their own government, by being tortured to death or being tortured, drugged, and dropped from planes into the Rio Plata to drown. Brodsky's school photos shares a date with my college image, but his fellow pupils' youth make infinitely more agonizing the realization that their future destroyed many of them and marked every one of those who survived with the trauma they can never dispel. The book we are discussing is an extraordinary elaboration of various themes Marianne Hirsch and Leo Spitzer have developed in their previous work, singly and in collaboration. It's clearly about transcultural memory and post-memory. But they're also taking up the idea of multi-directional memory through the lens of their concept of liquid time. Liquid temporality, as I understand, concerns contingencies and effective registers rather than the dry, unalterable technological rationality we usually associate with photography. Liquid and multitemporal reading displaces the retrospective gaze, backshadowed by predetermined outcomes, that has dominated the ways we've read images of violence, war, and genocide. They're asking us to re-see these pasts in different and affecting encounters now, with a specific genre of photograph that already implies its own moment as a past and our own forestalled or wrecked future. The register that we're being asked to look at these photographs is that of what they tell us about social inclusion and exclusion and about the social institutions of modernity. It almost echoes Zygmunt Bauman's expanded understanding of the dark logic and indeed the genocidal rationality of modernity itself. We do not find ourselves here in the camp, and we are not in one extreme experiment, but rather we are seeing something that became horrifically normalized across the modern world of the new nations that were formed in the 19th century. They ask, why do these photographs exist and what do they do? In one sense, they document a particular crime, denied crimes of dehumanization through the extinction of difference under the rubric of nationalization. These authors are asking us to feel, as they plot across the archive, the strategies of imperial framing, the framing of difference, and the resistance of the disobedient gaze. They define their overarching frames as the study of institutional apparatuses, the school rather than the family, and the generational cohort rather than the multi-generational group. If the school photograph frames sometimes invisibly the institution which captures to transform the child as social subject, it's also creating those subjects as this generational cohort. School photos create lateral relations between an age group that emphasizes thereby date and time, but also age. Both institutionalization and cohort making happen in these images, as they argue, under turbulent political times. Hirsch and Spitzer's study takes it as its heartbeat and creates it as its effective urgency, the photographically traced experience of both authors who themselves were forced migrants, as they've already told us. But the book as the whole is a cumulative indictment of the role of the school as political instrument in the violence of racism, in its mental, psychological, and cultural war against not just difference, but generative otherness that might contest the monistic view of what is the true, right, and the only good that underlies so much of the colonial, imperial, and evangelistic projects. Their purview embraces a wide range of acts of real and cultural violence enacted by settler societies such as the United States and South Africa, as well as by the creation of concentration camps for Japanese Americans established during World War II, to the dirty war of the Argentinian dictatorship against university students. To our now rich and varied theories of photography and as power, and photography as power, in the terms of class, gender, and sexuality, Marianne, Hirsch, and Leo Spitzer are elaborating what they term the institutional gaze and its social technologies for the forced transformation of both child and dissident adult in relation to the colonial and the imperial, the genocidal and the evangelical. In fact, what I came to recognize across their book is the dreadful intimacy of the colonial, imperial, genocidal, and evangelical as the four faces of modernity. They are in effect detailing through frozen moments of assembled class cohorts the racism and what I'm calling the monism, the oneness of any system that believes that what it is doing is right and is the only right way. We might then ask if difference, in fact, is at all compatible with the monotheistic ideologies of that Jan Assmann, the cultural historian, identified as the idea of a true religion that renders all others mere paganism. I found myself wondering if modern political domination under the rubrics of national or democratic universalism is also shaped in semi-religiously defined absolutism. While documenting the attempts to erase difference, such as you see here in this industrial school in Pennsylvania, imposing uniformity on the children of the many nations of the North American continent, while erasing them, these photos reveal the modernist ideology that in its many guises is the foundation of the dehumanizing crimes these photographs so tragically record as the necessary work that the perpetrators called re-education. Now, I found myself, therefore, going further back into the images in this book, not so much a reading of more locations and instances of school photographs, as much as considerations of the school as this social apparatus. Swinging back to the missing school photos that would tell me about my white South African childhood and transposition to a majoritarian Francophone and Catholic Canada, and then the traumatic encounter with British class culture, I thought about recent revelations of the sexual abuses of children in the schools run by the Christian Brothers of Australia. Many of these children being sent there by the British government and told they were orphaned and without relatives, and leaving them at the mercies of these strange institutions. In this photograph, which is put up by Philip Nagel, he discovered that 33% of the students in this image had committed suicide after the abuse they suffered. I also thought of the forced separation of children of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, known as the Stolen Generation, and who were forced to be separated because they were not allowed to be left with their own Aboriginal mothers because they had been fathered by white men. I also returned in the light of the present agony and outrage against the violence menacing, violence against the murderous racism spreading through the United States and acknowledged in most of Europe. I returned to the sections in their book about the violence menacing children during the attempts at desegregation following the Brown versus Board of Education ruling in 1954. Education also has a different value for those who've been denied access to it or the resources adequate to it, which was the case of African-American children seeking to have access to the richer world of the white education system. And the solitary figure of Ruby Bridges with her security guards protecting her as she dared to go to school in New Orleans is the counter image to the solidarity of the class photo. I chose to enter this discussion lightheartedly through my own missing school photos and recovered elements, because I lived through turbulent political times. But none of these threatened my life, although the education I was offered did deny my cultural identity and heritage as a woman and deprived me of the knowledge I wanted to acquire as a feminist. But these personal reflections made what I came to read in school photos in liquid time infinitely more poignant and personal. Centered around the images of children, the book by Marianne and Hirsch and Spitzer is not just about some children and some turbulent political times. It performs its own unique form of memorial and memory work to the multiple but specific historical crimes which certain processes of modernity attempted to use to end time, in the sense to redirect its subjects from their own times, historical and personal, by forced assimilation, by concentration re-imprisonment, by the suppression of first languages and their imaginative universes, and ultimately by both cultural and real murder. In this delicately and finely argued book, image by image, situation by situation, this huge undertaking makes visible makes available to us to study this everyday photographic form as a window on the logic of modernity and on the role of the state, whose deadly repercussions resound across the cities of the world today in the current protest and rage, which is telling us that we still don't understand what is really going on and where it has come from. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Griselda and Ava for their responses. So Marianne and Leo, first of all, I wonder if there's anything you'd like to pick up on in what's been said. You're still muted at the moment.
Well, there's so much to say, but I couldn't be more grateful to Ava and to Griselda for their attention to some of these images and for their thinking about these children that are looking out at us, because that's really what we wanted to evoke in our book and also in the exhibition, is how do we align ourselves with the children rather than with the institution. So just one word of clarification about the image from Sedlice that Eva talked about. This was given to us by Judith Greenberg, who teaches at New York University and who's been working on this story. She's actually a cousin of Rachel, of the little baby who was saved by the two Polish school friends. And she's, I think, written in the chat and offered to provide some additional information, and who actually took it upon herself to make friends with some of the descendants of the two Polish rescuers. And then they actually staged a return to the town of Judith's entire family and Rachel's family to re-encounter the students who are now currently studying in that school. And I think that's an incredible moment. And on the website at the Hood Museum, you can actually see a short film about this. But look forward to Judith's book, who will tell us much more about what she could find out about the motivations that are so hard to read from a simple photograph. So thank you so much for considering that.
I just want to add to Marianne's, actually the thank you, Griselda. Thank you, Ava, for incredible comments. And I'm very eager, if we have some time, to get some questions or comments from people who are viewing this, the audience.
Yeah, so if you'd like to write any questions in the chat, then we'll be able to see them. So Eva, did you have anything you wanted to add at this stage?
Is there anything I wanted to add? I don't know. I mean, I suppose, you know, schools, you know, the one thing to be said about schools is that they're the first institution of acculturation and kind of socialization. Have there been benign schools, do you think? I mean, I don't want to be Pollyannish about it, but have you found models of schooling which are benign, or is that not possible until the society as a whole changes, and we so far have not had perfect societies, that's for sure.
Well, that's a tough question. I think there's something about these images that's so coercive that actually shows us the disciplining of school, and actually the kinds of effects and the kinds of disciplinary structures that Griselda brought out so movingly in her real indictment of school. And yet, I think we also need to think about the opportunities that schools offer. And we also need to think about ways in which the family itself can be coercive and destructive, and school can offer children a way out of that institution. It's not like the family is not also an institution that can be coercive. I think that there's something about accreditation, state accreditation, that makes schools conform to certain standards, and we see it in all our societies. And there's so little room within that, but there is some room within that to invent and to build children's imaginations. It's been very interesting to think about this moment where children are at home rather than at school, and to watch the lack of structure. We have 2 grandchildren with us right this minute, and to watch the lack of structure. And my first thought was, this is terrible. These kids need structure. And then I saw them just roam around, discover things, find things to do, find ways to create that are outside those structures. And I'm wondering what the effects of this moment of no school will be in the future.
The schools are the fascinating question that you just asked in relation to schools, of course, makes me think again of the photos that were taken during the Holocaust, particularly in the ghettos, and particularly the clandestine photos. I mean, the very fact that schools, classes were established during these periods, and that there was some effort to maintain some sense of the enlightenment of the positive aspect of what one gets in school. That's the thing that it's so fascinating, that people under these incredible conditions still went back to the institution of schooling, and they extracted or tried to extract from the schooling what they considered to be the positive message, the alternative to what was happening to these children.
Well, I mean, it was something, yeah, it was something that they really desired. If I may just quickly ask, well, you know, 2 things. I mean, first of all, you know, schools are the site of socialization. They are also a site which enables rebellion in a way, I think. I mean, often. I mean, in other words, you know, you have to be inducted into a certain system of thought in order to be able then to, you know, fight it and contest it. I know it doesn't happen on a large scale, and it doesn't happen in this. It didn't happen in the settings which you were looking at. I just wonder, but I don't want to take up too much time. Did you come across the figure of Janusz Korczak?
Of course.
Yes, of course.
Of course.
Yeah, but I mean, that's another, you know, there is another model of education, which is incredibly moving and inclusive and well, I mean, you know, incredibly moving, and eventually it became very heroic, and it offered children who were orphaned, who were unschooled, who were street children, an opportunity for a fantastic mode of education, and it was democratic. I suppose that's it. I don't know if there are schools these days which follow a more democratic model. You would think really there should be, but I don't know. But he had a completely democratic model, if I may just say briefly. These schools, you know, he had an orphanage and a school, eventually just for Jewish children, because it was not possible to have it for both Polish and Jewish. But, you know, there were orphans, there were street children, there were abandoned children, there were scamps, there were, you know, early sort of criminalized. In the school, they had their own newspaper, they had their own parliament, they had their own courts. And it was the courts, I've read some of his essays in which he transcribes the sort of the discussions they had. They tried each other's transgressions, you know, and so, you know, they discussed questions of compassion versus justice, for example, and what does justice inhere in. You know, it is a very, very stunning model. It had a terribly tragic end, but it is a stunning model. There are court-check associations throughout the world now.
Could I just come in there myself, because I think that's wonderful that you've raised that history of this wonderful character, Janusz Korczak, and what the model he is. I think we need to make a distinction between education and learning and what the particular use of the school. So one of the things I was picking up is if you take children away from the family and subject them to something where those schools have relative absolute power over them, it matters what the beliefs of the people who are running the schools is. And I was indicting not schooling or education, because that's why at the end, little, you know, Ruby was there to say, I want to go to school and I want to have a school like yours, which has got all the resources, as opposed to, you know, the appalling conditions in which African Americans were going to go to school. And we know that that's the problem. Resources, all the things that make school possible. But the kinds of schools that you are identifying, whether it's boarding schools for indigenous peoples or the stolen generation, or schools which had to come, you know, excluded people, you are specifically in your book talking about imperial frames, the whole legacies of colonization and the formation of certain nations, which goes hand in hand with a certain evangelization. And if we don't recognize that somewhere in this, and that's what I was touching on, when you have a sense that one religion is the true religion and the others aren't, you create, and the combination of this is one of the problems that we have when we ask, why did we end up with racially motivated forms of cultural or literal genocide, right? What is it that is in this logic of modernity that produces that notion of this rationality, and we have it? So Zygmunt Bauman says, if you say we, whoever that we is, determine the rationality on the basis of which you are weeds, or you are different, or you are primitive, or you are backward, or you are miseducated, or you don't have the right to exist, that's when we are in trouble. So certainly in the dialectic of modernity, all of us want, you know, and all the enslaved people wanted to be learned, you know, to be read and write as the empowering of the means. And that's the same thing I was saying about, you know, I wasn't in bad times going to university, but from a feminist point of view, from the whole women's movement, what we were taught was a kind of form of cultural exclusion on the basis of what looks like a kind of trivial difference compared to the loss of identity, depriving you of, you know, things. And if you think about, for instance, someone like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who was saying about in you know, African literatures, we will not write in English, right? Because it's falsifying the child's own sense of what it's heard as the prime language, the first language of its imagination. We, you know, must write in Kikuyu and not in English. You know, and that big debate about what English did as even as a language of enabling children all over the world to read about Wordsworth, but know nothing of the poetics of their own mother tongue. these are all very important decolonizing issues and things, and that's what I'm certainly not thinking we might say, are there good schools as versus bad schools, you know.
Oh, and I was just
people
inserting that, you know, just
education.
because this also exists, and I actually do wonder what's happening now and what effect the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, might have on schooling and how schools are conducted now, for example. And I won't talk on, but, you know, just one more thing to say. I think I did say it in a sense that, you know, that schooling also develops the instruments of skepticism and instruments, you know, for non-conformism.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have very much time left, so I'd just like to ask a couple of the questions that have come through from the audience. So one question is from Zofia, I think, and she's asking you, Marianne, why in your school photograph you weren't wearing a pioneer's kerchief? Was that an act of resistance?
No, I was wearing one. You didn't see it.
Okay.
I was wearing one, but not all the children were wearing them. And that was because it was 3rd grade. So to become a pioneer, you had to be 9 years old and you had to be a good student. So if you were not yet 9 years old, you didn't get the pioneer kerchief. But if you're not a good student, which is one way that difference is marked, then you didn't get it. It was not automatic, it was an honor. But I was wearing one.
May I just say I never wore one. That was my parents.
Were you resisting? Yeah. Well, I mean, this is how you get caught. You know, you might not agree with it, but you're proud of getting it anyway.
Yeah. And then just a sort of question, possibly from a slightly different angle, is we've got a question from Janet asking about what do you think of the photographing and social function of the prom photograph, now such a big thing in kind of modern schooling and modern representations of people's school experiences?
Well, like many of these formal kinds of images, sometimes the event is created to be photographed. That's, you know, in family pictures, you see the very same things. So the question is, what are these images actually promoting? What kinds of ideologies are they promoting? And how are these resisted? And how are they also commodified? Because it's also, the prom is, you know, a way to spend money. It becomes a status symbol.
There's another side to the prom, and the prom is usually an event that takes place in connection to graduation. And so it's kind of connected to graduation photos, which of course are photos that certify that you have part of that grouping that has made it up over time and together over time. And it is a kind of report card, you know. So this is a kind of lead-in to the report card. It's just another little side view of it by having the graduation, which is the event that will bring you to graduation.
Okay, thank you. I think, unfortunately, I'm really sorry to all of those that haven't had a chance to have their question addressed. We are slightly overrunning. So I'm just going to thank all of our speakers, Marianne, Leo, Ava and Griselda, so much for all of their contributions. We'll be sending you a follow-up email tomorrow, and I'll hand over now to the director of the Wiener Holocaust Library, Dr. Toby Simpson, for some closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you to all of our speakers. It's been fascinating to listen to all four of you, and I'm sure everyone joining on Zoom and YouTube will have also thoroughly enjoyed it. It's been a great introduction to Leo and Marianne's book, and the exploration of its themes by Ava and Griselda, and then also in the Q&A, has been absolutely fascinating to listen to. So thank you so much. It's been satisfying, I think, especially to hear such a nuanced discussion of the types of material that we collect, preserve and share at the library. And I've always felt instinctively that school photographs, including the hundreds that we hold, aren't just records of the past, they're repositories of memory, and they have an immense potential for investigation and analysis. So I think the speakers tonight have undeniably proven that hypothesis, and I really want to thank them for that. I just wanted to mention, because some of you may not be aware, that the library holds an estimated 35,000 photographs Of course, they all require conservation, care, cataloguing, indexing to reach their full potential, which I think the potential has already been demonstrated tonight. So I'm hoping that you won't only be inspired to purchase a copy of this fantastic book, but also consider supporting our work, whether giving a one-off donation or perhaps becoming a friend of the library. One possibility, in fact, that I was reminded of was that the library, you can create a plaque on our wall of honour. And I've always felt that Janusz Korczak would be a fantastic person to honour in this way at the library. So do contact us if that sounds like something that would be of interest to you. Our speakers, Marianne, Hirsch, Leo Spitzer, Eva Hoffman, Griselda, Pollock, thank you so much for coming and joining us. We look forward to welcoming you all again, whether in person or online. I just invite everyone who's listened to subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on social media, visit our website to keep up with what we're doing. But I just want to finish by congratulating especially Leo and Marianne on their fantastic book. And I think we'll all give you a round of applause, even though most of us are on mute, we can do our best.
Thank you all so much. This was fabulous. I just wrote in, I hope we can save the chat because I was listening and didn't have time to read all the comments, and we would love to see.
I've saved it. I've copied it and I've saved it.
I've never figured out how to save the chat, but thank you all so much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Good evening, everyone.
Goodbye.
Okay, bye.